Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here for a conversation between myself, Sharon Kallis, and Allan Brown. I am situated here in a place known as Vancouver, British Columbia, the unceded territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam peoples. And it's an honor to have spent a couple of weeks with Allan this summer in Brighton, um, sharing many stories and many conversations, and that leading to this moment where we're picking up the threads of some of those conversations. So thank you, Allan, for carving some time out of your Sunday night.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I was just recollecting this afternoon that we've had a few Zoom calls together over the last decade or whatever it is, and each one of them has been has raised the bar and just clarified a lot of stuff, and also just given me a sense of okay, it's not completely crazy why I'm doing what I'm doing, and maybe what we're doing, um, and I think, yeah. So I feel that where I want to, even though we've sort of talked roughly about where we want to take the conversation, I think it's really. I just want to quickly skip over what those jumps have been for me, and just a sense of why we're actually doing this, why are we having this meeting and conversation at all. So yeah, that's my
Okay.
launching pad.
So I want to read, this was the email. I'm just going to read a little bit in terms of like giving us some edges for our conversation. So here's the world building that I proposed for some future speculative textile thinking. The year is 2125. Universal basic income exists. Housing is a right and not a commodity market, and various food security systems are in place. Clean water is a precious resource. The world's industrial power looms have stopped. So, how are our descendants clothing themselves? What do local textile economies and communities look like? And then I said, is there anything that you want to add to our world building starting point? And your comment a little bit to just summarize, you said that the juicy bit for you is how we recognize where we're at and how we transition ourselves as smoothly as possible to 2125. I feel that what we are doing in our idiosyncratic ways is rooted in that in this initial phase. And feeling like the two vital strands of that transition is going to be gardening and textiles, the two areas that we are both probably most grounded in. So how do we bring feeding and clothing ourselves within planetary boundaries? So
Yeah.
I have needed distractions this week mentally. I've needed my brain to be able to shift into other things that felt more hopeful. And I actually found it was really kind of a relief to have this notion to just consider and to step into thinking about. So I actually have a list of a couple of things, but I would love if you want to start in any of the pieces, because you specifically are thinking about the untangling. Is there anything you want to start us off with throwing out there to consider?
Yeah, I mean, I think, my journey into textiles was just completely unintentional. It was just following a feeling and not really thinking about it in terms of the broader perspective. I just wanted to know how clothes could be made from stuff that I had around me, as an extension, I guess, of having been involved in a nominal symbolic amount of food growing for most of my adult life through permaculture and that kind of thing. And it's really only latterly that I've realized that, of course, fibre and farming or foraging, but growing is very much part and parcel of the same package. So, in fact, a lot of the things that apply to how we feed ourselves organically in a non-fossil fuel way is going to apply to fibres and clothing. Um, and when I talk about making clothes from nettles and flax that's grown, I keep checking myself, going, this is kind of crazy. We've got power looms, we've got a whole lot of history behind us where we've technologically developed how to totally make this system efficient, and we've got an abundance of clothing, and what the hell am I doing playing around, tinkering around with these archaic means? And then it's really only as I've been kind of listening to, spinning allows you a lot of time to listen to podcasts and that sort of thing. And I've been listening to, some seminal conversations with a lot of it with Nate Hagens on his The Great Simplification podcast, which I recommend to loads of people. And of course, I also realize I'm preaching to the choir. I mean, I'm late to the party. There's going to be people on here who know all this stuff already, but I just don't think I'd quite recognize the depth of challenge that we're facing. And it felt like whilst I'm playing there's actually a really kind of serious level to this, where we're so far, because of the carbon pulse, because we've discovered this incredibly efficient, easy to access source of trapped sunlight, that we've been able to just transform the whole planet in a way which is the exception, because we've been born into this is all we know. And it seems like how things were done in the even not so distant past seem really kind of archaic and no longer relevant. But there's a guy called Tom Murphy who writes the Do the Math podcast, really, really just puts facts and figures to a lot of these intuitions, which I think is just really helpful. And he did this really interesting exercise of going, if we take the last 3 million years of humanoid evolution and compress it into 75 years, the average life of a human being, what would that look like? And it's like we've got 70 years of not a lot happening, very, very unremarkable, just someone gently living their life, having very low impact. So if we imagine it as a great aunt or uncle or something, for the first 70 years of their life, they were just nothing to write home about. They were just quietly getting on with it. And even in the next 5 years, where Homo sapiens emerges, even that's the same. It's just chugging along at this kind of steady state, low impact, sustainable way. And then it's suddenly after all that time, like in the last 15 weeks, something weird starts happening with Auntie Mabel. She's and this is the age of civilization. So the last 15 weeks of that 75 years, suddenly she starts acting a bit strange and doing things different. And then in the last 4 days, it really ramped up a level, and she was starting to get really weird. And that last 4 days is the age of science. And it's like she discovered the drug stash and started toking on marijuana and like just acting out of the norm. And then in the last 36 hours, that's like the age of fossil fuels. It's like suddenly she's on crack. It's like the whole behavior is just completely different. She's complete, and then in the last 12 years, which equates to 50 years in this analogy, it's like she's just gone completely nuts. She's trashed the apartment. She's standing on the windowsill, thinking she can fly. And just everything is just chaos. She set a light to the bathroom. It's all, the house is going up in a blaze, and this has just happened in the wink of an eye. And that's sort of where we're at. We're at that in this last part where it's gone nuts. We're burning the planet. We've lost 80% of the old growth forest. It's like we're living in the anomaly. So it's really difficult to sort of try and look outside of that, of how far this energy source and the economics model that we built around how we ride this one-shot wave of energy. And when we did that talk at the Remakery a few weeks ago, and I mentioned that figure about how a barrel of oil is the equivalent to 4 or 5 years worth of work from a human adult, working 35 hours a week. And it turns out when you total up all the fossil fuels that we're burning, it's like we've got a collective slave workforce of 4 to 500 billion people working behind the scenes to even keep up the system that we've got at the moment. And as we come down that slope of needing to, well, I mean, even putting the temperature rise from CO2 emissions and all of that aside to 1 minute, just the actual amount of energy in the form of fossil fuel we've got, how it's going to become increasingly hard to, we've taken all the low hanging fruit, and we've just built this, this structure on growth. And all the economics that we have is built around this system of never-ending growth. So when we talk about the elections and stuff happening, and over here, we've just had elections and the party came in, talking about growth, we're going to add growth and stuff. And it's like, if any of our politicians are coming in on growth, we know that they're absolutely insane. What are we doing? And it's a really difficult, this exponential growth model. Again, it's like, because that's what we're used to, it's really difficult to imagine what else it could be. And even, and as you start digging into it, you realize, oh, it's not a case of we'll come off fossil fuel and we'll replace it with sustainable energy. It's like our energy usage, every bit of time we've discovered a new source of energy, we've added it on. It's called the Jevons paradox. We just use more. We've just stacked renewable energies on top of our oil energy. We aren't reducing that in any way.
Yeah.
And the amount of energy we use is another, just this exponential curve, and we're just using more and more and more. And
that's going to grow with AI, of course, coming in as well, right? There's like AI doing things it doesn't need to do that is still costing energy being produced.
Massively energy hungry. And I think the hope with AI is that it introduces efficiencies into the system, which may give us another like 10 or 15 years or something of tracking on this totally energy hungry thing. But if we carried on this growth, the growth curve we're on at the moment of energy usage, even if we were replacing it with solar power or wind power, this again quoting Tom Murphy here, within 400 years we would have to cover every single square yard of earth, of land, with solar powers to keep up with that. And then within 1,000 years, we would have to be capturing the energy from the sun with solar panels totally surrounding the sun. And then, it's just crazy. It's just never going to happen. So, which then brings us down, what does feeding ourselves, clothing ourselves look like when we pull it back into planetary boundaries? And the only place I know where to look is to look at what people were doing prior to this massive fossil fuel energy rich crazy party that we've been in. And it's and that's why I think what we're doing and others in our textile posse are very, very much acquainted with and working with is like, how do we use the resources we've got, and how much of it do we take back and do ourselves? And I feel like we're in this little window where we've got the opportunity to sort of play at this to a degree, but I feel very, very shortly the external pressures are going to really come in quick. Like, it suddenly may not be possible to send our wool to China to be washed and then spun over in Italy and then brought back here. Just we've developed incredibly efficient systems through our economic model, but really, really unresilient ones. And we need to flip that right over and create really resilient things that aren't as efficient, which I think ties into what you've talked about, this curated efficiencies and inefficiencies and that sort of thing. But it's, just to round off, it's like it's now plainly obvious to me that not only do we need to massively reduce the amount of clothing that we produce, and in all the complexities of this world that we've got to transition down to within planetary bounds, it feels like textiles is the low-hanging fruit. We're creating 500 billion garments a year, most of which end up in landfill, all taking energy, most of it being built on synthetic fossil fuel plastics, and that's, the environmental damage that's been wreaked is huge. So it's like, here's an area where we can just cut through the excess and just bring it right down. And I think because, and this is another thing we talked about, how textiles seem to be the thing that fueled the industrial revolution in the first place, that it's the thing that's probably going to show us how to come out of it. And the natural curbing to excess is just the amount of time that we actually put back into making clothes really ecologically. And to do that, it means our labor, our time that we put into clothes is going to be much higher, and the output much lower. But in order to bring our collective energy usage down, I think we are going to have, we're going to be, you mentioned universal basic income, and I'm not sure whether that actually will be the model, because I think that the sort of taxation system that we're heading into probably won't work along those lines. I don't know, this is all speculative, but I think the amount of time that we're going to have to spend on food growing in a gardening sort of way, and textiles also in a very small way of doing it, is we'll probably be working collectively far less on the sort of things that we spend our times doing now, and much more time is going to be available for just covering as much of the basic things that we can take back. And that's not going to be it shouldn't be a sense of loss. It should be a sense of gain, that the thing that we do or the thing that we enjoy most, being in the garden, being in nature, growing and making clothes for each other and feeding each other, and that a lot of our time is going to go back to being spent on those pursuits, which then lands us back into where I think where we really wanted to start the conversation is what does that actually look like?
Yeah, and something that I'm really thinking a lot of right now, William Morris and the arts and crafts movement was really that kind of counter culture push against the industrialization. And I'm thinking about now, here we are, 100+ years ahead, and we're looking at the kind of incoming AI and the push that's creating, and the terror that's creating. And that lands us back to the notion of anything that we are making with our hands. Every time we are involved in an action of self-care, working with our hands, feeding ourselves, clothing ourselves, using our fingertips and those fine motor skills, that is innately connecting us to our humanity and allows us to step off of the commodity train, right? To step off of that cycle that we are otherwise just being cogs in that commercialized consumptive machine. So there's a couple of things that you mentioned I want to just kind of like riff on, because you were using the term play in notion to how you and I do our textile work. That's in kind of like a slow, meandering way, figuring stuff out, learning how to do it, finding other skill holders that can kind of like share. And there is a playfulness about it. And I want that to be something that is seen as positive and not pejorative. I think that's really crucial. And one of the things that I've been thinking about in that is that we are, and others like us, are the keepers of capacity. So in this time that we live in right now, the more that we can be learning of traditional skills, the more that we can be sponging up, soaking up, figuring out, and sharing. Like, for everything we learn, we need to teach people how to do that thing, hoping that one of those people it's going to stick with and that they can continue passing it on. Because um, the alternative of losing the capacity completely, how many objects are there in museums that we look at now, like thinking even of like Egyptian textiles and looking at how those were woven, so many threads per inch, that's just unimaginable to conceive of now. We need to not lose the skill that we have, but also on the notion of play. So this is a bit of a tangent, but bear with me because I'll come full circle. Where we work out of, one of the parks we work in, we share the garden space with the soccer fields that are right beside us, that are these huge AstroTurf monstrosities, in my opinion. And the soccer players are always on the lawn practicing, warming up before game time, and so the lawn is always torn apart, and there's just soccer players everywhere. And it drives me a little batty. And it's weird because like soccer is the one sport that I actually played for a short period of time in my childhood. It was the one sort of team sport that I was involved in. And I've been thinking about this and the culture around soccer and around sports, and specifically around like as a child, I was on an Optimist soccer team. And so I got thinking about this and I just did a little research, like Optimist, like the Optimist soccer team. What was that? And so Optimist is actually an international um, um, group or franchise or nonprofit, whatever. But the Optimists ran the soccer teams that you basically paid a small amount for your child to be on a team. Every team was made up of a variety of children or adults with whatever set of skills, and then they played against each other. And that was, how everybody kind of was together in the soccer, whether you had skill or not. It didn't really matter. You were there to have fun. You were there to kind of like play with others and connect. And I was thinking about like this culture that exists around sports and the culture that exists around parks and recreation, and how in cities we use our city parks and come together. And I thought, what if we actually had like the textile optimists? What if the optimists was actually that same notion where people grew up in an environment where they were in school and they learned in education the baselines around textiles and food and collective land tending of a commons, and there were programs that people were learning all the different steps and having a chance to be in it and find areas that they connected with, and that the social structure was there to support that continued investment and involvement as a part of your community circle as you aged up. And so that by the time you are 30 or 40, what could be known as like, the beer league for soccer could be like the beer league for textiles. What if it was like just a notion that was a common thing that we got together on the weekends and were collectively helping in, now is when we're going to harvest, or now is when we're doing the breaking, or I'm on the scutching team. Like that notion of having people that were getting together as a part of how they participated in their community and they connected with their peers and they met others, and that was kind of like our social language of gathering was invested in these communal projects, and that the fibers that were being produced were going back into whatever that textile commons might look like. It might be a part of the education system for work that's ongoing in schools. But within that there's also the acknowledged people who are doing it full time, who are the professionals, the masters in a particular craft or a particular skill that are being paid for their time. And so that notion of if everybody was recognizing how much labor and work is involved, I think automatically your respect and awareness for a garment is going to increase, and the understood value, inherent value of a garment is going to grow, but also the respect for who the maker is and the understanding of the amount of skill that they hold in producing that garment would enable a baseline price to be paid for objects, or for those skill holders in a community to have a value to their work that was fitting, right? And that they kind of like
Yeah.
were a part of it. So anyway, I'm really thinking now, I'm kind of obsessed with the notion of like the optimist textile club.
Yeah, that's that's a really interesting idea, and I totally agree. I think it you know whether we get a period of AI happening, which I'm very skeptical it will because of the amount of energy that it's going to need, or whether we start disentangling ourselves from this way of doing things, which is it just can't endure. AI is going to replace a huge amount of jobs in the even if the traditional model keeps going for a while. And as we come off fossil fuels, I think it will result in the same thing of us having a lot more time to do things slowly, because it's the beauty of textiles is it's well, I mean, food growing textiles and shelters, are our the primary things we need to survive. And I find it really encouraging that those skills are largely within the capability of most people to play a meaningful and active part in those things. I mean,
Do you think they are? Do you think most people have the capacity to, at this point, feed themselves? Or like, I know
no,
people that don't know how to
no,
put a button on.
yeah, no, I don't. But I think potentially
Okay.
none of these skills are so far out of, it's not like only some of us are going to be at the level where we can build a nuclear power station or
Right.
whatever. But gardening and cleaning fleeces or processing fibers, these are kind of skills which are doable, and also there's no limit to the finesse or artfulness with which we can do those. And that's one of the things that it's always fascinated me as I look back at museums of textiles of old, or in paintings or whatever, and it's like, however tough life must have been for our ancestors, they were able to go over and beyond what was strictly necessary for just clothing themselves. They didn't just make functional clothes, they made beautiful clothes. At least some of them were
Yeah.
so far above and beyond. So it's yeah, so that I totally agree that this is the one area where, well, food and textiles are the areas whereby we can take control in a meaningful way. And I think what I'm really attracted to, just this, the simpler and more resilient the thing we build, the better. Over efficiency. Efficiency isn't the, we've seen where efficiency's led
Yeah.
us. It's just meant huge profits for a few people, and loads of people actually being way worse off than they were without before we even got started down this line. So it's like, I feel that the most resilient tools for making textiles are the simplest ones. Even if we curb it right back to just drop spindles, backstrap looms, things that we can just make from sticks and simple things in our environment, that it's still possible, and that can endure when so much of our life now is just, we've got, you know, we're we're just not able to fix it. We're not able to get the parts for it. We don't know where to begin. There's, you know, we're totally dependent on the system and really complicated supply routes. And you know, I do wonder when the snapback happens, where that will fall. I mean, hopefully it will bounce back, and we'll have some vestiges of the ways of working. But you know, even a powerful big factory with loads of spinning machines and weaving machines, even if it's replaced with solar energy, and you know, how long will that be able to go on before the factory that's making the components for the computer to operate that, suddenly we're not able to make that anymore because of disruption. You know, we're not going to be able to be running huge earth moving machines to dig up the earth to get rare metals for making batteries, and you know, all that's fossil fuel dependent. We just can't build the infrastructure to replace fossil fuels. I mean, there's been no renewable energy made off the energy from renewables. The whole infrastructure we built is from this baseline of oil. So you know, it feels like whether we design it or whether we end up being just thrown into it, we're going to have, you know, bioregional fiber sheds, local. It's like at the moment it seems like, oh yeah, that's a nice idea, and wouldn't that be cool and stuff. But it's like, no, this is actually, we really are going to have to make that work. And how we make that work is obviously reduce our excesses down to much more manageable things. But because we're looking at it from this one, you know, there's large parts of the world where that's happening already.
Yeah.
They've never transitioned out of that particularly. Elements are, of course, but so for us it feels like, oh man, we're hitting this brick wall at 100 miles an hour, and it's going to be you know, the drudgery of going back to spinning, and it being just total nightmare of that we stepped out of. For me it's like, of course I can't really know, but thus far the vibe I get from hanging out with textile people, like I do with food growing people, is just this really kind of unitary giving communities where you're happy if the gardener next to you becomes a good gardener. You're not threatened by them being a good gardener. The better gardener they are, the better it's going to help you. Same with clothes. It's like, everything I've needed to learn, someone's been willing to show me and take time out of their day to show me. So it's like, and while of course we will always have people who are really experienced and adept and much more efficient than most of us would be, in that, like you say, they will, that class of professional will hopefully endure. But for the rest of us, I think this really small scale, like, even we don't need tractors and huge harvesting equipment to plant big fields of flax for a few factories or producers to clothe the rest of us. Us just growing small beds of flax and harvesting a certain amount of nettles within our environment at the capacity that we can work at in and around the other things is enough. I mean, it's probably the same with you. Even though I only grow a few square yards of flax every year, I'm running at a surplus already. I'm storing more than I'm actually processing. And
Yeah. And it's, sorry, go ahead.
no, that's
Oh, just that, you just reminded me of how often you come across in reading about in textiles and the history of textiles, the notion of as soon as anything and anywhere, any you could fit this to any model, but specifically within textiles, where as soon as an industry became, popular or commodified, and a region perhaps became known for a particular thing. And so the scaling up begins to happen. And that's where suddenly, flax retting became problematic when they're retting in ponds and they're retting for like
Yeah,
a global scale, no longer retting for a community scale. And so, that scaling up becomes really problematic. And so now we're at this point of like, okay, so we need to scale back, we need to scale down, we need to scale locally, and then also thinking within that, where are the curated inefficiencies versus the curated efficiencies? And that's something that I think, like you comment about where we need tractors or combines and where we don't. And there are like for instance, having pulled hemp with you at Wakelands at Contemporary Hempery, pulling hemp is tough work. I would not want to have to pull a field of hemp by hand, as opposed to pulling a flax crop. Still, it's physical work, but relative to hemp, it feels doable by community. If you had a large group of people that could come
yeah,
together for the period of time. And the notion of certain jobs do bring joy, certain jobs are rewarding and, feel good to kind of like physically be doing, or are beautiful, like the hackling. Claire was commenting on how much she loves the hackling. And, there's a big push right now happening that I observed both in the UK as well as here in North America, of where we're trying to figure out the line spinning and like the wet line spinning. So everything is pretty much the industrialized cottonized linen, which is fibers having been cut short and spun on a cotton mill. And so the strength has been lost, and just recognizing how challenging it is to get a a wet line spinning mill happening in various places, and then having conversations with people that do actually love the spinning, and spending time with Simon and Anne and the equipment that Simon is figuring out of how he is now drafting line on gutters, so that it's laid out and rolled up, and he's able to feed that through a simple distaff that he's made onto an e-spinner. And that for me was this eureka moment of like, oh my God, this is so much simpler than how I am spinning line at home. And like, the steps of where that, or the work that is happening with fantasy fiber mills for spinning on, those smaller systems that can fit for communities. So there's lots of places there that I think are worth really um, teasing out the steps of where we need support, because it's just too challenging, too cumbersome, um, too much labor, versus where the areas that we actually can build into some kind of a community um, operating system where people are gathering together.
yeah. No, I mean, I agree that there's, we can massively reduce the impact of textiles on the planet and bring it much closer to being in bounds using these sort of smaller scale interim um, things like e-spinners. They're going to speed things up to a degree, but I do. I mean, I know I tend to. It's not. I don't have a pessimistic view about where it is, but I just don't know where the line is going to fall about what kit is going to be able to be kept on a long term basis. I fear that as we contract from this carbon pulse, and the supply chains that we put up, that they will, I feel that we need to secure the baseline of hand skills, like, you know, like spinning and that sort of thing. You know, it's interesting seeing, you know, those amazing spinning machines that Rosie from Fantasy 5 Mil was experimenting with, and you know, it's going to need some tweaking, but you know, they will be eventually they'll be up and running and producing fiber, but or producing spun yarn. But even then, it's like those are digitally printed bits of equipment using electrical components, and you know, if I was in charge and I had access to the budgets of the last dying embers of the carbon pulse, and I would be building loads of those, you know, looms that the pedal powered looms they use on Harris, and I think there's that mechanical level where we can keep that sort of equipment going for. I mean, some of those Hattersley, the Hattersley looms are, you know, like 100 years old, and people get them going again, and there's people knowing how to make parts for those machines, and we could probably keep those going for a long while, just repurposing bits of existing metal with tools that we have, and you know, those definitely add efficiencies. But you know, I think that the human hand, the body ability to work with the range of fibers that we can do is astonishing. It's like the when things are mechanized, you need uniformity across the system, so everything's set up. It's the same with food, with growing the fibers. They need to be planted in such a way that a tractor can get down the field at certain widths and certain heights, and then it needs to be processed at the same length and stuff. All those things don't need to be done when it's hand. You can spin a mix of different fiber lengths. And you know, I mean, I sort of joke that the future I see is we're going to use this technology, which has been billions, but certainly millions of years in the evolution. It's got this incredible feedback loop, and it's conscious, and it can work on the fly in different conditions, and it runs on vegetables. And be like, what the hell is that? And you go, it's the human being. It's like we are the ultimate organism for actually doing this, but the output is low in comparison to machines that can churn out 500 billion unwanted garments a year. But we clearly don't want that, and everyone that I've spoken to is like, who makes textiles and clothes and is involved going, yeah, the thick clothes I want to make in the future aren't going to be boring, natural, coloured fibre, you know, clothes from the 18th century or whatever. I want to make this cool thing with these colours and doing this, and I'm like, yeah, let's totally celebrate the diversity. Well, like the clothes that you make, and you know, every time I see something that someone's made, where they've taken back at least some of the process themselves, are just so much more interesting and functional and cool, and it's like it. I don't know. I mean, it doesn't at the level I'm doing it at the moment, which is not. I wouldn't even really be clothing myself, let alone anyone else. It doesn't feel like drudgery. It feels like hard work at times, getting the flax in and processing and stuff. But the more people that take on the more of their work for their garment, the more affordable it is for everyone to be clothed with. You know, clothing was traditionally one of the most expensive things that you would own. And it becomes expensive when you outsource the making of that garment to specialized people who need to be paid for doing that. But you know, if you're prepared to, you know, we've got this. I don't know what the situation is in Canada, but here we've got wool that's being just buried, burned, or left sitting in barns. You know, fleeces by the. We could be so self-sufficient in fleece in wool, both for garments and for rugs and for curtains and all manner of things, if we
Yeah.
just use what we've already got. And it, you know, and a small bed of flax per person, many of which can be grown on allotments or gardens or just little corners and crannies, which when we go up a scale, it needs to be a regular big size field. But when it's taken down to a community individual level, we can squeeze these little patches of things in all over the place, and it's manageable. You can do it. You know, you couldn't get a tractor up that narrow little path up to that sloping slope where you're growing the flax, but you can get there by foot and grow in these spaces that machines can't access. And from what I've read about the future of how we feed ourselves, according to the World Health Organization, is that hand gardening is hands down the most efficient way of doing it. It seems counterintuitive that where you've got machines and tractors doing it at scale, but you've just that the whole infrastructure that feeds even that is sort of hidden from sight. You need the factory fabricating the metal, you need the parts, the rubber, you need factories to assemble it, then to get those, you know, all these things like when you start stacking up the actual environmental cost of that structure in place, it's like it soon just exceeds the limits that we're needing to bring it down under. But hand hand gardening, you can plant using height, you know,
Right.
growing stuff up here, planting other stuff next to it, little flax bed there, dye garden there, and then it's crammed in a diverse and ecologically rich way, which just, you know, farming even at the next level up is it's losing soil structure, losing soil depth, breaking all the you know, these micro fungal networks under the soil, living soils, all the, you know, it's so it's, to me it's like, how do we make living within the boundaries not only practical, but that's where we're going to find the things that we're missing, and that we're craving for.
Yeah. Yeah, that make us human, right? That kind of like fills us, that in many ways, I feel that's why people go shopping when they don't actually need anything. They're trying to kind of like, you know, fill a hole or fill a void that they're feeling, because they're not actually physically engaged in that kind of human impulse to take care of oneself, to take care of our loved ones. I'm
Yeah,
reminded of a book I read years back, one of my favorite um, energy critics, who's Canadian from the West Coast here, Andrew Nikiforak, wrote a book maybe 15 years ago called The Energy of Slaves. And it's a really fantastic book for just kind of underlining how we are so dependent on fossil fuels, and putting that into a kind of like long view of here's how humans, a small percentage of humans, have, you know, lived off of the backs of others who were enslaved, and how what we are doing now is basically supporting a vast majority of people living in the same equivalency as that 1% from
yeah,
ages back. And there's one line in that book that particular that really struck with me, of how animals that are hunting prey have this innate sense of when they might be you know, chasing, I can't remember what he uses in the book as a metaphor, but maybe it's like, you know, a leopard is chasing after an animal and will run and run and run and run and run, and then at a certain point will stop and just stop trying. And because they've internally been able to do the math to calculate that the number of calories that they are going to receive by completing the hunt and killing the animal is no longer worth the exertion of the amount of calories that they are expending in order to
Yeah.
capture those calories. And then he equates it to fishing on the coasts here. And I think in the book, he's specifically talking about the East Coast, but that notion of how much energy is exerted to go out further and further into these places to try and fish for what is at the end not going to be an amount that uh, equates to the energy consumption for the catch. And
Exactly
I think
right.
this
Yeah.
is just like a human, you know, a human foible in general, the amount of times that we get our head on kind of like the end prize and are no longer, you know, prize and are no longer sort of thinking about all of the pieces involved, especially when the systems have become so complex that they're obfuscated and we can't see them anymore.
Yeah. I mean,
So,
I would be making the figure up, but it's something like we expend 10 times the amount of energy for every bit of energy we get from the food that we grow. You know, so it's seen like a miracle of civilization that we can feed 8 billion people, but we're only doing so because we're expending at least 10 times the energy in the form of fossil fuels to do that.
yeah,
And so it's, you know, it's a no sum gain again. It's like
yeah,
we
yeah,
can't, that energy is not going to be available to run that system. It's gonna, it's just, it's not going to work in that way. And it's like, how do we, how do we take, how do we um, fill the shoes of those 500 billion slaves in the form of fossil fuel at the moment? It's like it's a radically different world, and one where we just we shrink our well, even shrink sounds punitory. It's like we pull back into the most essential core things that, like you say, our humanity is like the joy of hanging out with each other, the richness that we have from experiencing each other, and our shared enterprise of growing the food and clothing ourselves collectively. I mean, of course, there's 100 and other things. You know, you always look at the world through the prism of the things you're into, food and clothing. So I'm looking, but you know, we all have to just,
yeah,
you know, work within the parameters
yeah,
of our thing, and um, and you know, the sense of accomplishment and joy of like us grazing our sheep in a rotational way whereby we've got happy sheep, their impact on the environment is lessened. We use that fleece and we as gently and energy efficiently as possible turn that into garments and rugs and stuff that we need to make our life warm and comfortable and cool. Um, that's just going to fill this horrible void that we have in us, like you say, that makes us want to go and out and shop, because we've got some of the brightest people on the planet focused on making us feel that we're lacking, and that, you know, we need to buy. You know, it's like if that, if all that intelligence was actually kind of directed to, like, hang on, you know, like, you just innovative sustainable solutions, like, hang on, get we could put a bicycle pedal thing onto that sewing machine and just
mhm,
do it that we could
yeah,
sew that way. We could um, we can create, the fact that clothes are so closely related to farm, gardening. The fibers are grown, the fibers are foraged, and the fibers are collected off our livestock. That's when it's within planetary boundaries. That's a renewable system which can just keep chugging along. We just slowly convert those fibers into the form that we need to use them by. They, it's like what one fleece or a couple of fleeces will give you a woolly jumper. With mending and stuff, that woolly jumper can last you for years and years and years, and then but next year there'll be another fleece coming up,
Right.
and
Yeah.
so it's kind of like, of course we're limited by what we can do because of the slowness of the methods that we'll be using, but it's a completely resilient, or much more resilient system.
Yes.
And then at the end of it, we aren't polluting the world with microplastics. We're composting that stuff back in. It's beautifully circular, and
Yeah.
the relationship with these garments is just totally different. As anyone who knows, who's made anything, your relationship with that thing is just so much richer. And then when your mum gives you that piece of cloth that served her well, it's like it's just a treasure.
Yeah.
It's holding memories. It's, oh man, it's just not comparable to the stuff. I mean, the clothes we get are amazing, and the fineness of the thread that machinery's been able to do is astonishing. And who was I talking about this to just recently, was how we're probably part of the transition we're going to do is it getting our bodies used to wearing fabrics that aren't as fine, because our clothes are so, we're not even aware that we're actually wearing clothes half the time. They're so light and different to the stuff that when you make it by hand, it's got or using natural fibers, it's got a weight to it. But there's also, because you've made it and because you're on top of the processes, and like, suddenly mending clothes is a no-brainer. When you see what it takes to
Yeah.
make it from scratch, it's like, I could spend the next year making that thing, or I could just fix this thing and keep it
Yeah.
going. And it's like this mind change that we need to embrace. And just,
Totally.
and I think for us at the far end of this carbon pulse, it feels like a loss. It feels like we're losing. We're going to be losing something, rather than trying to reframe it as like, no, we're going to do it differently, and we're going to try and do it in a way where we can set up a system that can just run on and on.
Yeah, and so we're out of time, but I want to just on that, I want to say, like, a system that can run on and on. Something that we haven't really talked about in this is education, in a direct way. We've kind of circled around it,
Yeah,
but if like you said, if you were in charge, so if I were in charge, I would have textiles and food right at the baseline from K to 12 in
totally
education.
agree.
It would be something that was a lens where other things are being taught through that lens, whether it's, biology and chemistry and physics and maths, like all of these social histories, all of these things can be taught through textiles and food growing. And that notion of having students leave school with a really grounded, solid understanding of what's on their backs and what's on their plate and what has gone into the making of that garment, the making of that meal. really reframes how we would go forward in thinking, and then creating the systems that allow people to carry on in those pursuits in their own learning, as well as just community gatherings and participation.
Yeah,
Yeah,
love that.
that to me would be a huge thing. And I'm gonna stop the recording here, and
Okay.
we're gonna carry on the conversation. Thank you so much, Alan, and
Thank
yeah,
you.
to be continued.
Of course.
I just have to figure out how to end the recording again. Here we go. All right.